The world's highest glaciers are melting. Scientists warn at least a third of them will be gone by the end of the century. Even if climate change is stopped now, how badly will their disappearance hurt billions of Asians who depend on them to survive? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. The highest mountains in the world are the source of life for more than 1 billion people spread across Asia. The Himalaya and Hindu Kush peaks contain vast amounts of ice locked in glaciers, but scientists are warning that precious resource is disappearing at an alarming rate. The Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment report says a third of all glaciers could melt by the end of the century, even if we meet most of the ambitious climate change targets that could threaten water supplies for 250 million people in 8 countries. The glaciers feed 10 major river systems, home to more than 1.5 billion people. They may soon struggle to meet their fresh water, food and hydroelectric needs. A more immediate fallout could be catastrophic flooding as melting glaciers cause rivers to rise. The brunt of this looming environmental disaster is likely to be felt in the Himalayan foothills in Nepal. From the capital, Kathmandu, Subina Shrestha has more.
I'm here in Kathmandu, where scientists have come up with a deeply distressing report. The International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, or ICIMO, based here, recently released a report where more than 200 scientists came to the same conclusion. At best, 1/3 of all glaciers of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region would have melted by the year 2100. This is if the Paris Accord is kept and global temperatures increase just by 1.5 degrees Celsius and carbon emissions are drastically reduced. It still means that in the mountains the temperature would have increased by 2.1 degrees centigrade. If temperatures keep increasing more at the current rate, if it goes up to 2 degrees, half of the glaciers would have melted by the year 2100. And if it goes up to 4 or 5 degrees centigrade, then 2/3. Now, the Hindu Kush Himalaya region ranges from Afghanistan to Myanmar. It's a 3,500-kilometer area, and major rivers systems are fed by these glaciers, from the Ganges to the Mekong. 250 million people live in these mountains, and 1.6 billion people live downstream. It means these people are going to be impacted by glacial lake outbursts, floods, and droughts. This region is also home to some of the poorest people in the world who live under $2 a day. Their lives are going to be impacted the most. Subina Shrestha, Al Jazeera, Kathmandu.
Over to our panel in Kathmandu, Nepal. By Skype, Eklabya Sharma, Deputy Director General of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. In New Delhi, India, Chandra Bhushan, he is Deputy Director for the Center of Science and Environment, India. And in London, Asad Rahman, the former Head of International Climate at Friends of the Earth. Welcome to you all. Mr. Eklabya, are we talking here about a damage that is already done and an irreversible trend as far as the glaciers of the Himalaya are concerned?
Yes, already glaciers are retreating, the people are getting affected, we are having more floods, but the danger is that if we are not able to address these issues, then the situation is going to be worse. So that is the main problem. And this particular publication which has come is a comprehensive assessment which gives us a very good idea of what is happening in this region.
Mr. Bhushan, how significant are the findings of the report?
First of all, extremely important report, and I must congratulate EC Mode for coming out with this important report. simply because there was always this controversy over Himalayan glaciers, whether they are shrinking or not, whether they are gaining mass or not. I think this report has conclusively proved that the glaciers have receded in the last 30 to 40 years, and that if we do not reduce global warming, if we do not reduce emissions, it's going to be drastic for our part of the world. So extremely important report, fills an important gap in knowledge, and we have to take this report very seriously.
Mr. Rahman, I mean, for many years, each time we were talking about climate change, it was basically about glaciers in Arctic or Antarctica, talking about the political debate, the climate deals, particularly the landmark 2015 deal. But suddenly we have this impressive, comprehensive, thorough report coming from about the Himalaya, taking people by surprise. I mean, what is the most important element you would retain from this particular report, Mr. Rahman?
Well, I think there are a number of very important aspects. I mean, first of all, as you mentioned, it does an important job because it shifts the debate. For too long, European policymakers have framed climate change primarily around either the ice melt in the Arctic or around the small islands, when the reality of climate change and its impacts is that it will devastate the people of Asia, Africa and Latin America much, much more. And we're already seeing that when we look around the world and what the impacts of killer floods and droughts at just 1 degree warming and the experience of people on the front line there. So I think it brings home that reality. It also brings home the reality of the huge impacts of climate change and the reality of its impact now and the urgency of us to act. I mean, when we're talking about 2 billion people impacted by the melt of the glaciers, it begins to contextualize that when we're talking about climate change, it's not something that's in the abstract or in the future. It's having an impact now. And of course, the reality of climate change is its greatest inequality. The majority of the people that are going to be affected are the ones least responsible, are the ones on living on less than $2 a day. So policymakers, you know, yes, this is another alarm call, and climate scientists have been making more and more alarm calls. The key question is, what is the political will to act? And when we think about that, half the global emissions that are in the atmosphere at the moment have come in the last 25 years, when governments already knew climate change was happening, when they knew that they needed to act. And now when climate scientists have told us we have less than a decade before the worst impacts and we get into the tipping points of climate change, the reality is, of course, very little action is actually on the table.
Mr. Sharma, as Deputy Director of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, the organization which requested the report, if you look at it, you have different highlights. Glaciers, which are receding, potential for mass population displacement, a new political and environmental reality that the world has to deal with. Which would you pick as the top priority for you?
I think here the livelihoods of the people is quite critical, not only in mountains, but also affecting a large number of people downstream. So this is one of the most irrigated region in the world, and this is the food basket, and almost 3 billion people are partially dependent on the food produced from the basins that are actually rivers originating from the mountains. So in this context, I think the first immediate action is to really see how we take care of people who live in the mountains. And when I say mountains, then also the ecosystems, and then it relates to the relationship between the people up in the mountains and downstream. I think that is most critical.
Mr. Bushan, I'm sticking here with the very technical aspects of the whole report before going into the potential solution to this whole problem. So it basically says the following, that even with all the measures that humanity could think about, the damage is already there. What happens is that the glaciers are receding because of the thaw. Massive lakes are forming. They will one day burst their banks. We will see massive floodings. But at a later stage of this whole climate change saga, what happens is drought. People will suffer, and then people will have to leave their own areas. I mean, how serious is this whole thing? Are we talking about regions? Are we talking about billions affected? Are we talking about something that could have a knock-on effect on the globe?
Let me contextualize the kind of ecosystem we are talking about. This is a semicircle extending from Pakistan to Afghanistan, India, China, to Arakan Hill region in Myanmar. So, and about 2 billion people live in this area, dependent on and they are dependent on either in terms of water or they are staying in this ecosystem. This is also one of the most highly densely populated region of the world and has sustained civilizations for centuries. Now, in last 40 years, we have lost about 10 to 15% of the glaciers, and there are already local impacts. If you move in this area, you will see local stream drying up in the hilly region. Also, apart from the fact that the glaciers are receding, we also have extreme rainfall events. In 2013, for example, in Uttarakhand in India, this area suffered devastating flood which killed thousands of people. Now, those kind of things are also going to increase. So on one hand, we are going to see reduction in water over a long period of time. But in the short term, we will also have extreme rainfall event, which is going to devastate this area. So this is a very serious implications because of climate change. But there's other part which this report has talked about, that is the kind of ecological destruction that is happening because of poor development policies. The biodiversity is getting affected because of deforestation, as well as insensitive land use changes that is happening in Himalayas. This area is also highly polluted in terms of air pollution. And as well as, the kind of infrastructure project we are setting it up is also affecting the environment. So we actually have a double whammy in this region. We have global warming, but we also have poor development policies, which is affecting the environment.
I get your point. Mr. Rahman, when I first saw the report, I said to myself, oh God, I think these countries need an immediate Marshall Plan. What is it that they should be doing in the short term to contain this huge crisis?
I think you're absolutely right. We do need a global Marshall Plan. We need to recognise we're in a climate emergency, and at the centre of it, we have to put people, and we have to put their right to a dignified life. So that means guaranteeing people the right to food, to right to energy, right to the basic amenities that give people the right to live a dignified life that we all want. That means transforming the way we produce and consume our energy. So it means moving away from the fossil fuel extraction towards community-owned renewable energy systems. It means fundamentally also protecting our food systems, because at the moment we have a strange food system globally where we have an agribusiness model which heats the planet, which means nearly 1 billion people don't have enough food to eat, and yet we plough a third of all of the food that we grow into the ground again. So we can fix that. We can protect the kind of food systems that originate and that exist in that region, in India and Pakistan, etc., which feed so many people in the world. And of course, I absolutely agree with my colleague. One of the things we can do is we can give local people land rights to protect them against this development and infrastructure development. At the heart of it, we can't solve the climate crisis until we also solve the economic crisis.
Okay.
And the economic crisis is we've got an economic model which is built on extracting wealth and extracting resources. And so it's impossible to say, let's solve the climate crisis without also recognizing this is an economic model that is failing people and planet.
Mr. Sharma, this is a political issue at the same time and a scientific issue. But how can these countries set aside some of their differences? I'm referring to the political tension between the Pakistanis and the Indians to be able to team up, move forward, and tackle the problem.
I think I'm very optimistic. Ishimod is convening all these meetings of these 8 countries, and the cooperation has been fantastic. I think we have to raise this from technical to really a political level of discussion. And the report is not going to be the end for Ishimod. We have summary for policymakers. And now the 8K call to action is being developed from the report. And we are going to the countries first. And we plan by 2020, we would like to have a summit of the environmental ministers and relevant ministers in Kathmandu to really see how we can take things forward. But meanwhile, we already start some of the actions, some of the solutions with consultation with the countries. So our approach is very much bringing the countries together
look at the more regional issues. So most of the things which we are discussing is not concerning just one country. All countries having this mountain region need to work in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region together with common framework.
Mr. Bushan, some of the predictions of the report are cataclysmic. I mean, cataclysms of biblical proportions, like the drought, the famine, and the potential for some rivers to dry up like the Ganges. How can countries that are poor, having their own problems, cope with something that requires, as we know, billions and billions of investments?
So I want to answer first question in a sense that I think this report also raises some important issue on national security. It talks about bad relations between India and Pakistan, but it also talks about the data information gap and data sharing that is absent between all these 8 countries. So I believe that one of the outcome of this report has to be that all these 8 countries will have to sit together and develop a coordination framework to share information, share data, and develop a comprehensive plan. No one country can individually tackle this issue. So I think one of the major policy outcome of this report is that countries who are in HHK area, HHK region will have to sit together and develop an intergovernmental coordination mechanism to tackle this problem. Now, coming back to the issue of how do we tackle this issue, one of the panelists has very clearly said that we need an economic answer for environmental destruction. The people in HHK region are poorer than rest of the area. We need to come out with an economic development model which will make sure that these people are not dependent on environment in a way that destroys the environment. Okay. We need to promote sustainable development practices, including sustainable tourism, or, for instance, getting ecosystem services out of this area. We will have to develop an economic model that protects the ecosystem and still brings people out of poverty in these areas. Till we have a proper economic system, and it will be very difficult for us, frankly, with the kind of population that depends on this region, to solve this crisis.
Mr. Rahman, I mean, if you look at the report, it basically says that even if we try to meet some of the targets of the Climate Change Accord of Paris 2015, when it comes to limiting the temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius and bringing the greenhouse gas emission to 0 by 2050, the damage will still be done. Isn't this something that could lead many people to become very pessimistic about any outcome that might come in the future?
No, I don't think it's a question about being pessimistic. I think it's a question about being realistic. I think for too long we talked about climate change in a very abstract way, as if it didn't really have these kind of impacts. And I know many climate scientists and policymakers have said, well, we don't want to scare people. But I think the reality is we need to first tell the truth, and then we need to have real policies that give people hope. And I think the irony, of course, is within climate change, it is one of the greatest injustices and greatest inequalities, that the people who are the least responsible for this crisis are the ones that are being most impacted. But also within it is the possibility of having a vision of an economy and of a society and of regions which are better integrated, fairer, more equal, safer. And as what my colleague just said, it actually brings countries together to actually have to address this global problem. But you have to be able to identify what the issues are. And unfortunately, the reality is last year we heard from the International Panel on Climate Scientists who said, you know, we must stop a breach of the 1.5 degree guardrail. We're in decade 0. But the reality is our temperatures, in terms of what governments are willing to make the emissions reductions, are heading to at least 3.4 degrees and even higher, which will have devastating impacts. So we must be sober, we must be realistic, but we must also give people the vision. But the ultimate answer, of course, is do our politicians have the political will to act on the information and the evidence that's been put forward? Unfortunately, at this moment, they're not acting in our interests.
Speaking of that particular will, political will, Mr. Sharma, the whole report brings back the whole notion of whether climate change is anthropogenic, which is man-made. And as you know, many politicians, particularly in the right with the populists, say that this is an idea that has been fomented by the left in the past to try to bring about a political agenda. How do you think this could... Isn't this something which is definitely going to create more problems for the Hindu Kush Himalaya countries to bring international awareness back to the issue of climate change?
I think it will help us bring the solution for this region if the international committee comes in my opinion. I think it will help the countries to understand how the region can contribute very much for the regional development, but also it is a global asset, and how we can contribute globally in the context of the challenges we are facing. So I very strongly feel, I think the international cooperation is very much welcomed. The investment has to come. This Hindu Kush Himalayan region has been left alone for a very long period of time in spite of its importance. So investment is a big issue, I mean, for this region.
I see your point.
We need to get the investment.
Mr.
So
Go ahead, briefly, please.
Yeah. So what I very strongly feel is that there are various streams of investment. One is big countries like China and India could also help the smaller countries in this region, but also globally, because I think this region is contributing very significantly in terms of ecosystem services and in that context.
Here is my problem with this particular approach. I asked you a question about one of the challenges, which is the climate skeptics, and this is going to be my question to Mr. Bhushan. The second problem is that when you talk about benchmarks to meet, particularly when it comes to limiting the temperature to 1.5 above pre-industrial era, you're asking the world to abandon what it took for granted, which is the fossil fuel dynamics that have been going on for quite some time. And you're asking help from some of the most polluters on the globe, like China. So, Mr. Bhushan, what do you think should be the best formula to try to maintain sustainable economic development, but at the same time tackle the issue of climate change?
See, all the assessment very clearly shows that we will have to say fossil fuel goodbye. By, if not 2050, then by 2060, 2070. We will have to reduce fossil fuel consumption by 80 to 90%. Now, I have not come across any assessment which says that we can continue using fossil fuel and solve climate change. That's not going to happen. So I think the world has to start preparing for a world without fossil fuel. And the good part is that renewable energy is now becoming very cost competitive. In India, today in India, a solar power plant is competing with coal-based power plant. In fact, if you are building a new solar power plant in India, it is cheaper than building a new coal-fired power plant. I am expecting in next 20 to 30 years, if government policies are supportive, you will find that fossil fuel will not be able to compete with new forms of energy, whether it is solar, wind, geothermal, or any other renewable source of energy. So if we are serious about 1.5 degrees, and I believe we should be serious about 1.5 degree, otherwise a lot of people are going to die, ecosystems are going to get devastated, then we have to seriously think about a world where fossil fuel has minimum role and most of the energy supply is coming from non-fossil fuel resources.
Mr. Rahman, in less than 30 seconds, do you think that with the risks mentioned in the report, 1.5 billion people will be affected by this? We might see a sentiment building up in favor for drastic actions to be taken immediately?
Well, I think the voice of people all around the world is increasingly being heard and demanding action on climate change, demanding we move away from our fossil fuels. We need to keep those in the ground. And as I said, the solutions are actually also solutions not only to the climate crisis, but inequality. By moving to renewable energy, we can not only solve the climate crisis, but we can also bring energy to the 1.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to energy. So not only do we need to be saying no, but we need to be saying yes, a vision of a world that is better. And increasingly people all around the world are demanding that, and they're demanding that their politicians act accordingly and don't act in the interest of these fossil fuel companies, who we as taxpayers around the world are giving $10 million per minute to subsidize their pollution, climate pollution. It's madness. And and the reality of climate change, of course, is worse than we ever can imagine.
Thank you. Thank you, Asad Rahman, Chandra Bhushan. Eklabya, Sharma. And on Inside Story, we will definitely continue to shed light on this interesting issue. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.